On August 8, 2009, Anderson Silva walked into a cage in Philadelphia against a former UFC light heavyweight world champion who outweighed him by 20 pounds. The fight lasted 3 minutes and 23 seconds. It was not a close fight. It was not a survival job. It was one of the most visually stunning performances in the history of mixed martial arts. A round in which Silva slipped punches by fractions of an inch, smiled in the middle of exchanges, and knocked out a man who had previously beaten some of the best light heavyweights on the planet with a single compact jab at the end of a sequence that made the full arena go quiet before the noise came. Nobody quite knew what they had just watched, and that was always the thing about Anderson Silva. You could rewatch the same fight multiple times and still struggle to fully explain what was happening. The angles were wrong. The timing was impossible. Punches that should have landed by every reasonable measure somehow missed him cleanly, and he was already countering before his opponent could reset. So, how did he build that? What was happening in the gyms in the years before the world started paying attention that produced a fighter capable of making world-class opponents look like they had never trained a day in their lives? Welcome to Loving Fighters. Anderson Silva was born on April 14, 1975, in São Paulo, Brazil. His family was poor, and he spent the majority of his childhood in Curitiba with his aunt and uncle, the latter an officer with the Curitiba police force. He grew up with very little. To help support himself in his early years, he worked at a McDonald's and as a file clerk. There was nothing inevitable about what he would become. There was no clear path from that neighborhood in Curitiba to the longest title reign in UFC history. He started training Taekwondo at age 12 and showed enough ability that he earned a black belt in the discipline. As a teenager, he also began training Capoeira and Muay Thai. He was not wealthy enough to pay for lessons in his earliest years and found ways to train without formal instruction before he eventually joined a proper gym. That background of learning under limited conditions, of having to be resourceful and observant rather than simply being coached, may have contributed to the analytical quality he brought to the sport later. He thought about what he was doing rather than simply repeating what he was told. Those 3 disciplines planted ideas in him that would take years to fully develop. Capoeira in particular offered something that most combat sports did not: the understanding that movement itself is a weapon, that rhythm can be disrupted, that a fighter who is difficult to read is difficult to stop. He took that idea seriously. He would spend the next decade and a half finding out how far it could go. Before making his name internationally, he worked his way through the regional Brazilian scene, Japan, and the Cage Rage promotion, winning the Cage Rage middleweight championship in 2004. He trained at Shoot Box Academy, one of Brazil's most respected combat sports gyms, and earned a black belt in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu under former UFC heavyweight champion Antonio Rodrigo Nogueira. By the time the UFC signed him in 2006, he had been fighting professionally for nearly a decade. He was not a prospect. He was a finished product that most of the world had not yet seen. So, what did his training actually look like? Let us break it down section by section, because the details matter here, and they explain things about his performances that highlights alone never could. First, the striking foundation. Silva trained across multiple disciplines, and the thing that made him different from most fighters who cross-train was integration. Many fighters who come from a Muay Thai background treat their boxing as a supplement. Many wrestlers treat their striking as secondary. Silva worked to dissolve the walls between his disciplines until there was no longer a clear line between where one ended and the next began. Muay Thai gave him his elbows, his knees, his understanding of clinch range, and the precise sense of how distance creates and removes danger. His Muay Thai background was extensive and visible in the way he managed proximity, never comfortable at exactly the range his opponents wanted. Boxing gave him his hands and, critically, his head movement, the shoulder rolls, the lean backs, the slips that cause punches to miss by inches rather than feet. Capoeira contributed the misdirection, the feints built into footwork patterns rather than arm gestures, the rhythm changes that broke an opponent's timing before a counter, the weight shifts that disguise what was coming until it was too late to respond. And Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu gave him the ground game, the submission ability, and the psychological security that comes from knowing you cannot be taken somewhere you cannot survive. By the time he was competing at the highest level, these disciplines reinforced rather than competed with each other. The footwork created angles his striking could exploit. The head movement made his offensive entries safer. The ground confidence made his stand-up more relaxed. He held black belts across multiple multiple disciplines, not as credentials on a wall, but as evidence of genuine, years-long investment in each area. Second, the footwork and distance management. This is the element of his game that casual viewers consistently underestimated because they were watching his hands. If you slow down the fight footage and watch only Silva's feet and hips rather than his hands, you start to understand what his opponents were actually dealing with. He was never in a fixed position for long. He constantly adjusted his distance in small increments, giving opponents the impression they had a clear line to him when they did not. His ability to be in a specific place for the fraction of a second required to invite a punch, then not be in that place when the punch arrived, was the defining feature of his stand-up game, and it was built on footwork precision that most fighters at that level could not replicate. His defensive numbers in the UFC reflected this. He was extremely difficult to land on cleanly, and the strikes that did connect rarely landed with the force they were thrown with because of his ability to move with the impact or make the punch arrive at the wrong angle. This was not a natural gift that required no development. It was the result of years of drilling movement under pressure, against different styles, at different speeds, until it became automatic. Third, the approach to preparation. What is documented about how Anderson Silva prepared for fights gives a partial but revealing picture. He trained at Shootbox Academy in his earlier career, one of the most demanding environments in Brazilian combat sports. Later in his UFC tenure, he trained with the Black House MMA team in the United States. The documentary film Like Water, released in 2011, provides direct footage of his preparation for the Chael Sonnen rematch and shows a fighter who was intensely focused, technically detailed in his practice, and working across all his disciplines within single training sessions. His coaches across his career consistently described a competitor who took technique seriously at a granular level, who drilled specific counters and entries rather than simply sparring to stay sharp. Beyond that level of detail, the specific structure of his daily routines and conditioning methods is not something that has been comprehensively documented in public record. What is clear from results over a decade of competition is that his physical conditioning was exceptional, his technical refinement was constant, and his preparation was specific to each opponent rather than generic. Fourth, the mental dimension. This is the section that most analysts skip because it is harder to quantify than a finishing percentage or a takedown defense number, but it is also the section that most directly explains his most memorable moments. This is where most viewers misread what they were watching when they saw Anderson Silva fight. Those moments where he dropped his hands in front of an opponent, where he leaned away from a punch by what seemed like an impossibly narrow margin, where he appeared to smile in the middle of an exchange. People called it arrogance. Analysts called it recklessness. It was something more specific than either. In interviews across his career, Silva spoke consistently about the relationship between fear and performance, about using the energy of a fight rather than being consumed by it. His longtime coaches noted that he brought a quality of calm into high-pressure situations that was unusual even among elite competitors, whether that came from structured psychological preparation, from years of competitive experience, or from both. The observable result was a fighter who appeared entirely at ease in moments that broke other world-class athletes. He had practiced the specific distances his defense relied on so extensively that he could operate within them without conscious calculation. That is a technical achievement disguised as attitude. The results of all of it were historic. Silva made his UFC debut on June 28, 2006, knocking out Chris Lieben in 49 seconds. Less than 4 months later, at UFC 64 on October 14, 2006, he stopped Rich Franklin in the first round to win the UFC middleweight championship. That started a title reign of 2,457 days, the longest in UFC history. During that span, he posted 16 consecutive victories, tied for the longest win streak in UFC history. He made 10 successful title defenses, the most in UFC middleweight division history. The opponents and the finishes across that run made the record even more remarkable than the numbers alone. At UFC 82 on March 1st, 2008, in Columbus, Ohio, he submitted Dan Henderson, who was simultaneously the Pride welterweight champion and one of the most dangerous fighters on the planet, by rear naked choke in the second round. Henderson had controlled much of the first round and was legitimately ahead in the fight when Silva found the submission. At UFC 101 on August 8, 2009, he knocked out former light heavyweight champion Forrest Griffin in 3 minutes and 23 seconds at a weight class above his own. At UFC 126 on February 5, 2011, he stopped Vitor Belfort, one of the most feared first-round finishers in the sport, with a front kick to the jaw at 3 minutes and 25 seconds of the the opening round. And then there was the Chael Sonnen fight. At UFC 117 on August 7, 2010, Sonnen did what almost nobody had managed to do against Silva since his UFC debut. He controlled him. Sonnen took him down repeatedly, landed sustained ground strikes, and won the first 4 rounds on every scorecard in the building. With 2 minutes left in the 5th and final round, with the championship slipping away in real time, Silva locked in a triangle armbar from his back. The submission was completed at 3 minutes and 10 seconds of round 5. Sonnen had hit Silva more times in that single fight than in all of Silva's previous UFC appearances combined. His mind was clear and precise enough to find a clean submission entry in the final minutes of a fight he was losing by a wide margin. According to the CompuStrike statistics from that fight, Sonnen hit Silva 289 times across the 5 rounds. In Silva's first 11 UFC fights combined, he had been hit 208 times. Sonnen hit him more in one night than in a year and a half of previous title fights. All 3 judges had Sonnen winning every round he had been awarded, with 2 of them scoring one of those rounds 10-8. Silva still found the finish. That performance, more than any of his highlight knockouts, describes what he had actually built over a career. Then came the losses that changed the story permanently. On July 6, 2013, at UFC 162, Chris Weidman knocked Anderson Silva out in the 2nd round, ending the longest title reign in UFC history. 5 months later, in the rematch at UFC 168 on December 28, 2013, Silva suffered a severe leg fracture in the 2nd round that stopped the fight and required surgery. What went wrong? 2 things, and both deserve honest analysis. Weidman was genuinely exceptional. He was a wrestler with legitimate knockout power who understood how to remove the distance management that Silva's entire stand-up game depended on. He pressured forward consistently, took away the space Silva needed to operate, and punished the head movement that had made him untouchable against every previous opponent. He was not just lucky on fight night, he was tactically precise. But Silva was also 38 years old at the time of the first Weidman fight, and the physical tools that made his style work at its peak were no longer quite what they had been at 30. The margin on which his defense operated was narrower than it had been, and that difference was enough. He fought on, adding wins over Stephan Bonnar and Yushin Okami in the years that followed, but losses to Michael Bisping and Derek Brunson showed a fighter who could no longer operate consistently at the level that had defined his prime. When opponents applied early pressure and removed the movement, the system that everything else depended on lost its effectiveness. In November 2020, he was released by the UFC after 14 years. He finished his UFC career with a record of 17 wins and 6 losses inside the organization. Following his UFC release, he returned to boxing, a discipline he had worked into his training across his MMA career. On June 19, 2021, he defeated former world champion Julio Cesar Chavez Jr. by split decision in a boxing match. On September 11, 2021, he knocked out former UFC light heavyweight champion Tito Ortiz in the first round of another boxing contest. In October 2022, he lost a unanimous decision to Jake Paul. In July 2023, he was inducted into the UFC Hall of Fame, a recognition that had been a matter of when, rather than if, for years before it happened. His legacy sits at the top of any serious conversation about the greatest fighters in the history of the sport. 2,457 days as champion, 16 consecutive victories, 10 title defenses, wins over former champions and Hall of Famers across multiple weight classes. He was the consensus #1 pound-for-pound fighter in the world, according to ESPN, SureDog, and Yahoo Sports for years during his reign. He accumulated more knockout of the night bonuses in UFC history than any other fighter, earning 7 of them across his career. He was inducted into the UFC Hall of Fame in July 2023, a recognition that had been a formality for years before it happened. A style so genuinely original that coaches are still attempting to explain its principles to students today, and finding that the description never quite matches what the footage shows. You had to see it, and even when you saw it, you were not entirely sure you had understood what you were looking at. He built that style across nearly a decade of professional competition before his UFC tenure even began, through disciplines that he integrated rather than simply stacked, through opponents who tested different aspects of his game in different ways, and through a competitive career long enough that the losses at the end of it do nothing to obscure what the middle of it actually was. Thank you for watching. Loving Fighters.